Give me a second. Okay, which one is it? Ridge 60 or Ridge 60? Yeah, right. Pause, capital R. Yes, we can put 3 more. That's how I can remember it, because those have an explanation. That's wrong. Like, okay, well, that makes sense here. Just don't put that on Facebook. I do have a pretty, I mean, I still do have a pretty good memory. My wife accused me of that. Negotiators. Remember both of these forever.
Let me write this down for the chairman, so don't worry.
Yes, please.
Okay, she will accuse you of select the candidate.
Yeah, because she's the one that can't remember anything. She knows I know that. So whatever. So when she'll be like, I don't have to. Then I can here doing this at this time, and you have that.
Yeah. But okay, I'll send you an email right now.
This conversation. My wife. And in the first place, don't.
I just gave her 2
Wrong, or I don't remember. I know everybody gets this.
Yes, I gave you guys.
That's a comment. Yes, I said. I don't know. I think part of this is 17 years of rotating city manager, fire chief. Every time you try to change something, I'm going to do it if you want. And I give a history. And it's frankly not just a change to the city manager, it's also I want to do this, I want to do that. No, this is why this is impossible.
But the thing is, it gets repetitive, right? It's not like it's like, where have I seen that one? You and the previous 4 before you.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Lighter laptops, especially with their expectation of what you're supposed to do. Anyone can stay there for a while. They have to
Okay, I just remember.
And I didn't bring my, I just brought an iPad and stuff. I didn't bring my
I have to all I really have to do is nap for 2 days.
2:40 or rescheduled. At 2:40 again, so. And then the back half will get that. Because you can't move any of the rest of these up. The mayor can't be here. So we'll work with that.
Yeah, they're not letting us on that base.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay.
It's interesting to see. Tim, one of the fire folk apparently wrote a citation to Mark Rubin for working in a fire zone or something.
I usually try to find make up an excuse. But one night when I was in
Probably not.
best barbecue, it was in Kansas City. We got halfway across the state before we left.
Oh, yeah?
We thought to call. They were open on Mondays or whatever.
I suspect he was here somewhere next to Soul Refreshing. Because this is the day they have their.
Oh, we can tell you what that is.
No, they didn't actually do that.
Thinking about it?
No, it says, like, just so used to using that, like, you don't even assess it. So here's what it is. I have another data. It's supposed to have properly. They just need to do the signals.
Well, that's good, because the word we got, they were driving out to Appalachia. I
hope that's not accurate.
don't know, I was told to staff meeting. They're open.
It's supposed to be because these are all three different things. So you should always have some sort of personal version.
Takes a lot from there.
Today's one.
Lost it.
This one's a first time phone.
Which media?
Basically like a first responder priority service.
Let's go ahead and call the meeting back to order, please. We got ahead of schedule. We had a couple people who didn't talk as long as we thought they might, and we had less public comment than we anticipated. Some of the afternoon speakers are really on a pretty specific time schedule, so we can't move them up effectively. But we do have Chief Larry Collins from OES, who is not on the agenda but can talk with us about planning for catastrophic earthquakes, and to some extent that will carry over to other major disasters. And I think that's worth all of us hearing. So, Chief, if you would come up and speak with us for a bit, I would appreciate it.
Good afternoon, Commission. This was not planned, so a little bit impromptu, but one observation I had to make on the way in was the Freedom Park next door, and I happened to be going past there as a group of school children were making their way over and doing a ceremony. So, Ridgecrest is pretty impressive for that display out there, and it also reminds us that unexpected things happen. A long time ago, when I first started doing swift water rescue, actually with Director Ghilarducci as instructors, Jim Segerstrom, who taught a lot of us back in the day, kept reminding us to play the what if game all the time. What if? And think about outside the box things that you wouldn't normally anticipate. And we've done that ever since. And I think, you know, the 9/11 attacks were an example of that. Some people had played the what-if game. Some people had anticipated something like that. But it wasn't on everybody's radar screen, and we got surprised and had saw some things that we hadn't anticipated, like two of the world's tallest skyscrapers not just catching fire, but then completely collapsing within the first 2 hours. So, you know, here in California, with the seismic activity we have and the history we have here, and with the huge population and population densities that we have, and all the other hazards, including dams and tsunamis and all the other things that can happen, not to mention the fire scenarios that we've been having the last couple of years, and, you know, the potential for something like a great quake to happen in the middle of fire weather, where we have hot, dry Santa Ana winds or north winds blowing, which could exponentially increase the potential for fire becoming conflagration. That was alluded to earlier by the gentleman with the gas company, and about how the ignition sources could exponentially make the problem worse. So I think, you know, this is a good time to just reflect back on July and the response that happened there. We've heard great accounts of how the response on the emergency side happened. And I would add to that, in the mutual aid world in California now, where I sit, we're constantly planning the what-if game. And in that case, on the 4th and the 5th, ironically, current Cal OES Fire and Rescue Chief Brian Marshall, who was the Kern County Fire Chief until January, happened to have been at his home in Bakersfield getting ready to make his move with his family to Northern California. So he was in Bakersfield when the quake happened. Immediately, he was in communication with Chief Witt and the Kern County EOC folks and the OEM folks. So really quickly, they determined, you know, that they need to move some resources up toward Ridgecrest. Early on, they deployed engine company strike team and urban search and rescue resources on the 4th. And then on the 5th, with the 7.1 quake, he was once again at home, and clearly the magnitude and the shaking that occurred all the way down to Bakersfield told them that a lot bigger potential for collapse and fires up here. So within the first, 30 minutes or less, they were already ordering mutual aid without the damage surveys even having been completed. They made some estimated guesstimates, I could say, educated guesses on what kind of resources they would need. And within the first 30 minutes, you had 2 OES, Cal OES, Type 1 engine company strike teams coming. Those are the big fire trucks that do structural firefighting, the green rigs you see on the road sometimes. And they also happen to have what we call Type 3 urban search and rescue capabilities on each of those rigs that carry urban search and rescue equipment. And the personnel who staff those rigs are firefighters trained in urban search and rescue as well. Then they had a couple other engine company requests, including 3 Type 1 urban search and rescue companies from LA County, LA City Fire, and Orange County Fire Authority coming this way. At the same time, they deployed the California Regional USAR Task Force, 29 persons, from the Fresno Fire Department. That's Regional Task Force 5. There was 12 of those in the state of California, in addition to the 8 state national urban search and rescue task forces that just came back from Hurricane Dorian on the East Coast. At the same time, they deployed a Cal OES hazmat unit, and then 3 Cal OES assistant fire chiefs, all within the first minutes of the quake to assist the other response that was happening up here. And that speaks to a concept we've been discussing with regard to developing the renewed Southern California catastrophic earthquake plan. It's dawned on us while I sit on that working group, and in the development of that, along with Ryan and others, it's become evident that if we can cut down the reflex time, the time between it's recognized that you need more resources and then the time it takes to request them and for the state fire rescue mutual aid system to fill those requests, if we can cut that down, we'll save lives. And so one of the kind of out-of-the-box concepts we're thinking about is what I would call an earthquake box alarm system. Chief Witt alluded to that earlier about having a preset menu of resources that we would just automatically send based on the magnitude, possibly magnitude, shaking, population density, building stock. Some things we still would have to factor in and calibrate, kind of like what's going on with the earthquake early warning system. There's some calibration still going on to get it right, but that's a concept that we're discussing actively right now. I think that's probably a good way to go, and it'll have to be vetted with the rest of the fire service that that's a good concept, but it seems like there's pretty good agreement that that's something that will help us cut down the reflex time. And if it turns out that we don't need all those resources for that particular incident and we have to turn some of them back, that may just be have to be considered the better part of valor, I guess you would say, that sometimes we'll get it not exactly right. Maybe we'll overreact, over dispatch, but that's probably, I think everyone would agree, that's probably better than under dispatching in a disastrous or catastrophic event. So we're actively in the Cal OAS Fire and Rescue and Special Ops, and with all of our partners in local government and state government and our federal partners too, ESF 4 firefighting and ESF 9 urban search and rescue. We're discussing that actively right now. So I think it just highlights the fact that we have to keep playing the what if game. We have certain things that we are pretty sure are going to happen. We also have some unknowables, and we also have some things that we may not have considered. And so we're constantly playing the what if game and thinking about what we might have missed or what we can learn from an incident like the Ridgecrest quakes, which turned out, fortunately, not to be the disaster that we initially may have thought it was going to be based on the magnitude. But as I think one of the speakers earlier said, that if you had taken that quake and moved it down into the middle of one of the more densely populated urban areas, it would be a whole different story as we know it. So we would still be perhaps digging some people out who may not have survived at this point. We're seeing example of that around the world. Most recently in the Bahamas, where you have true catastrophic damage. And I would say that as prepared as we are in California and as accustomed to disasters as we have become, the kind of catastrophic damage where you lose entire systems and perhaps systems of government are having trouble functioning and communications is truly down for days, like we've seen on some of the hurricanes recently, where you literally can't get a hold of each other, and you're going back to almost what we would consider Stone Age technique of using runners to travel messages miles between commanders. That can happen here. We saw it. I saw it personally and did it personally in Hurricane Katrina in Mississippi coast, where I was on that one, where we literally had that kind of conditions. I think as good as we are in California preparing, we've been so good about a lot of our systems staying intact in the moderate disasters that a lot of us are probably not really accustomed to operating in the truly catastrophic scenarios. And that's where we're really trying to build that catastrophic earthquake plan to take into account those kind of conditions. So the earthquake early warning is another example of out-of-the-box thinking, playing the what-if game, and what can we do with that. There's a lot to be done there as well. I would say the Commission's work is every bit as important today as it ever has been. And now you have such opportunities to really, make some revolutionary changes because of the new technologies we're having and some of the new lessons we've been learning. I just applaud you for the work you're doing, and I'll take any questions.
Great. Does anyone have questions for the chief?
I do.
Sir.
Yeah. Is it Larry?
Yes.
Yeah, Larry, thanks for saying what you said. What are your recommendations for improving that reduction in reflex time?
Well, we are going to be looking at this idea of the earthquake box alarm system. It's really kind of something that we've been discussing informally and haven't really vetted it out. But to do it right, I think it would take a collaboration between some of the seismology community, working with almost what you see in some of the HAZUS disaster planning runs that they do. Something that would allow us really quickly to take into account where the quake is, what the density of population there is, what's the building stock look like, what kind of surface shaking did they experience on this quake, and then maybe other factors like the current weather. Like if we have Santa Ana winds blowing where that quake has occurred, there may be a ramp up that we have to build into it. But this is not completed at this point at all. It's really conceptual. But I think, just personally speaking, I think there is value to pursuing this. I think it will help us get ahead of that flex time. And some of those responses, I mean, on the larger scale quakes, we would be looking at requesting early on. I mean, I knew as an LA County firefighter and battalion chief, our plans were, if it's that day where we come out the door and there's columns of smoke already up everywhere and buildings down, it is the 7.8 or the large one everyone's been anticipating. We know that early on we're going to request all of the National Urban Search and Rescue Task Forces coming our way. We know just from the last couple of years of fires that we won't have enough fire trucks in the state to handle some of the conflagrations that could happen. In 2017, we had something like 600 fire engines coming from other states to assist us during the wildland sieges that we had. So on the international side, we're pretty certain that we'll be requesting international urban search and rescue teams for a catastrophic level earthquake, and we're going to want them as fast as possible with as few diplomatic and any other delays or air transportation delays, because we know that the clock is ticking when those buildings collapse. We've got survivors. We've pulled survivors out of buildings in places like Haiti, 6 or 7 days later. We've had survivability 2 weeks after an event like that. The record seems to be about 21 days, 16 to 21 days for surviving in a collapsed building, depending on the conditions. So we know that we're looking at round-the-clock urban search and rescue and firefighting operations for days and weeks. Probably it's going to be weeks for sure if it's the catastrophic event in a densely populated area with a lot of building stock and a lot of collapses. And so that's the part of the what-if game that we're playing out and trying to put that into the plans like the Southern California Catastrophic Earthquake Plan.
Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. Yes.
So if I could add, I mean, there's already a significant amount of work going into both the Southern California Catastrophic Earthquake Plan. We have a Bay Area one and then one based on the Cascadia Fault Zone. Just in terms of the federal and state response about moving assets from all over the country to different staging areas. So that way when the calls do come in, they can be quicker to deploy. You don't have to wait for it to come from the East Coast. When a local has a call, we know like within that first day, it's time to start moving resources in to be ready to go in. This next level that Larry's talking about, I think is very important because it can get down to a detail that may not be covered by, like there's certainly the big San Andreas event. We spent a lot of time on that, and we're already thinking through some of those scenarios. But what about those other ones where it may not reach that high level, but it's a notch below that? And we need to be thinking about those too, because even from our probabilities of earthquakes, that next level down's more likely than the biggest one, and then even the level below that is even more likely. So I think it's with this event that those, and especially now with the aftershock forecast, aftershock forecasting is becoming more, just anyway, the more and more that we know these hazards, we have these opportunities to speak within our own communities. We should be able to get there because it'll help.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and that lower level of probability of having that pretty large quake actually be the foreshock happened this time. So, we know that if that had been down in one of these more densely populated urban areas where was true urban search and rescue, collapsed search and rescue operations going on, and on day 2 you get the 7.1 or the larger aftershock, foreshock, or the primary, the main shock, that we're going to have rescuers potentially killed or trapped themselves in that kind of scenario, which kind of goes back to the value of having the early warning matrix that Ken Hudnut mentioned, being able to have that employed pretty quickly. So all this is there's so much interrelated systems and approaches that we're trying to take that holistic approach and play the what if game on a larger scale.
Yeah, please.
I don't know if everybody's aware, but FEMA, there was big omnibus legislation that was passed last year by Congress called the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, DURA. And there are a couple provisions in there that I think everybody should be aware of, because mitigation, pre-disaster mitigation is the key. And the section 1234 of this act is called BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities, and it's going to be a big pot of money that's going to be available to communities to do this pre-disaster type mitigation work, so that when the disaster comes, there's less for you to do. And right now there are discussions about what that's going to look like. So there's a mandate to do this, but we don't quite have a blueprint yet. And then earthquake early warning is another aspect that's being funded. There will be there's a lot of funding and support through USGS and FEMA for that.
Excuse me, but I know this is being recorded,
Ah.
and nobody's going to be able to hear you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
If we could, have you come up.
And this is information I'm sure someone's going to want to hear.
So again, this is Ann Rosinski from FEMA Region 9, and I just wanted to make everybody aware of some potential resources for communities going forward. Mitigation, pre-disaster mitigation is the key, and certainly, I think I mentioned this before, but building code adoption and compliance, we saw that was another one of the reasons that there was less damage out here, was because California is really great about adopting and enforcing codes, building codes. But some other resources that will be available, there was something, a bill passed by Congress a year ago. It's called the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, DURA. It's a huge omnibus mandate, not a lot of blueprint about how things are supposed to happen, but 2 specific sections. Section 1234 is BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. And it's going to open up a big pot of funding for infrastructure and communities, pre-disaster type mitigation. So when you're pulling together your disaster after action report, identifying what your future mitigation would be, keep that in mind, that hopefully we can get some funding out to help support, address some of those challenges. And then for earthquake early warning, that's another component of DURA. And right now, FEMA is working with the USGS, so the USGS will be doing the technical review, and FEMA, our hazard mitigation program, will be providing the funding to build and support the technical infrastructure that goes into early warning. And then the other part of that would be how that message is dispersed. But I just want to make people aware that these topics are getting a lot of attention. If you have input on what you'd like to see in terms of mitigation and what things you think should be supported, please let me know, because our headquarters is really interested in hearing from our stakeholders, what's important to you, so that as we develop the policy for these options, that we're taking into consideration what's important to you. So that's my little plug.
Thank you. Mr. McCarthy.
Larry, I have a question for you. Okay, so the haywired scenario, I believe, had 400 plus ignition points for a large event on the Hayward Fall. And that's pretty staggering to me, and how you could possibly respond in the Bay Area for that. And particularly now after these fires we had this year, how fast those things moved. And then I don't think we've seen one in an urban area since 1906, but I saw the evacuation challenges everybody had there in Paradise. So I guess what I'm trying to say is how are you trying to think out this fire following issue that it's going to be pretty devastating, I think. I don't think we ever seen anything like this, particularly if the wind's blowing like we had in Paradise. So.
Yeah, I think, and if you look at the shakeout earthquake scenario, we're talking that was the greater LA area, 1,600 plus ignitions. Each one of those would require, I think the criteria that Dr. Scawthorne was using was every one of those ignitions would require the response of a normal response of a fire, normal first alarm response, which is typically 3 or 4 fire trucks and a ladder truck and a battalion chief and a paramedic unit, to a single structure fire at a house, for example, and a few more units than that for a commercial building. Well, in this scenario, you're not going to have all those units to be able to respond to each of the 1,600 fires. You'll be lucky if you get, in some cases, one fire truck to, those incidents within the first half an hour or maybe greater, and they'll be by themselves, and they may not have water to fight the fire with, depending on what the condition of the water mains might be at that point, and what are the sources of water they may be, and whether they're prepared to drop eductors into swimming pools and pump out of swimming pools and all those other aspects. Chief Witt, I think, also alluded to the challenge of doing the damage surveys and having to, and we teach this to our firefighters. And when I was in LA County, we really emphasized this in the shakeout exercises that we would do before the formal exercise. We would put our firefighters through an online program that guided them through. You're in a fire station, the quake happens, you go out, you can't get your fire truck out the door initially because the apparatus door got racked because we didn't have earthquake early warning that opened the apparatus door before the quake started, before the S-wave started arriving. And so now you've got to spend time cutting your fire truck out of the fire station. Meanwhile, people are pounding on the door, and you see columns of smoke in the distance. And before you can even get out the door, there's people coming up injured and so forth, and you have to make some decisions. Those firefighters are supposed to conduct a lights and sirens route, checking damage, looking for the critical structures, and then reporting that back to the battalion chief, who then collates that information and starts to generate orders for more resources and so forth. So in this scenario, the fires are getting larger. The firefighters have to decide as they're going down the street, am I going to try to put this fire out or help this person that's trapped in this collapsed building across the street, or help the injured person that is laying on the sidewalk and people are trying to flag the fire trucks down. Really, it's a difficult kind of equation, because we tell them you need to complete that damage survey. That means they're going to be driving past incidents they would normally stop at. And in previous years, we would tell them, go past the fires, make sure you got everything figured out. Or is the hospital collapsed down the street? Are there school kids trapped in a collapsed school? Then when you're done your route, report it, and then triage and go back to work where you need to go to work. What we've been doing since really the Kobe quake, and Director Giliducci happened to be at Osaka, right across the bay, when the Kobe quake happened, and I was down there on the second or third day as an observer. LA County Fire sent observers to watch the operations going on with the Japan firefighters. We saw dozens to hundreds of blocks burned in the city of Kobe on a cool, moist day. It wasn't dry. It wasn't fire weather. because they simply ran out of firefighting water and had too much fire for the amount of firefighters to do all the search and rescue, and there was some mutual aid complications that day. But since that experience and coming back to Los Angeles and looking at the potential, we've been emphasizing more and more to the firefighters, hey, if you can stop and put a fire out that's going to become a conflagration with the 500 gallons of water you have in that tank of the fire truck, if you can at least knock some of it down, do so. If the building's going to burn and it's not going to spread to other buildings and it's an isolated building, let it go. There's an equation that is hard to teach and hard to quantify in writing. Some of its experience and some of its what we're trying to teach them in these exercises, that you're going to have to make a decision. Is that fire going to spread and become a conflagration? And can you do something about it? And if you can, do so. If you can't, move on and ask for more help. Try to find other sources of water. There's a whole matrix of things we're trying to teach the firefighters to be ready for this what if that's probably going to happen at some point in the state when we get a sizable quake. So, as we've talked about in the development of the shakeout scenario and the catastrophic plans, we know there are some short-term and long-term solutions that really need to be looked at for the water supply, for example, and what we can do to combat fires, and maybe having mobile water mains that we can, do a stopgap measure to get water into some of the areas that are being hit, and having more, instead of just fire trucks and a strike team, 5 fire trucks, which is a typical strike team, add a water tender to that strike team, augment it with it's more thousands of gallons of water that they can roll with and put out more fire as a unit. So these are all part of the out-of-the-box solutions that we're looking at. And it's because we're seeing that we have to play the what-if game, because these what-ifs are probably going to become reality that at some point here.
Commissioner Strank.
Thanks, Chief Collins. I agree with you 100%. And being in a large municipal fire department full-time, you're exactly right. Those are the decisions we as company officers have to make every time. But at the state level, and I know OES is aware, but I think for this setting also it's important to show that there's a number of the rural versus the municipal, the disparity of fire departments, how they're staffed, how they can respond, how they're their ability to pay, master mutual aid versus plan need, the 12 hours, what agencies are going to get reimbursed. I wasn't even totally aware of even the fire service up here, so I was doing some just Google searching. The closest paid fire station in San Bernardino County is in Hinckley, which is between Barstow and Four Corners. That's an hour drive right from day one. Mm-hmm. If the station that's paid call in Trona doesn't staff.
Right.
So I agree with you 100%. But then if you start thinking about, wow, if we get a big earthquake in Susanville or, up in Lassen or some of these really rural areas, and you could argue this is one of the rural areas too, that getting out the box early is even more important than it is in the population centers. We all train and we're all identifying Hayward and the Hayward Fault and the San Andreas and all that stuff. Well, those population centers, we're going to know exactly what's going on right that minute and make the requests.
Yeah.
But some of these rural areas, it's going to be a major, major challenge. And as far as the fire following thing, we've done a number of reports, 3 phases of it. There's a lot of research that's been done. I know it went to FireScope. I'm not sure where it is since then, but maybe if nothing else comes out of this, we can resurrect the fire following thing and dig it up and start, putting that back out in the front. Because my concern right away when we did it and we approved the phase 3 was this thing gets to the fire departments, and you know as well as I do, cool report, fancy binder. I got 42 other things, so I'm going to stick it right there and get to it next week. And when you retire, you're like, oh, yeah, I was supposed to work on that. Well, I'll give it to the next guy. So anyway, I'm
you're right.
fully agreeable. I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. And like I said, I've lived it for 32 years. But it is such – we've got to be at the state level so hyper aware of the diversity and disparity in fire service in California, and we haven't even started talking about EMS.
Yeah, I think Ridgecrest was a very good example of that. And as I mentioned earlier, ironically, Chief Marshall, who was the Kern County Fire Chief till just months before the quake happened, was right here basically in Kern County when it happened. And so, he knew the terrain. He had worked in this city. And so that's one of the reasons they got those resources coming before the damage surveys were even completed. They knew that they had a potential for not only fire following earthquake up here, but collapse and other things that, they were going to overwhelm the local firefighters here, so they were going to need help and need it now. So they got them on the road. The fire and rescue mutual aid system is as the most practiced mutual aid system in the world. Year in, year out, we're still, as Chief Marshall would say and Director Ghilarducci would agree, we're looking at all risk all the time, all hazards all the time, and trying to cut down that reflex time. And I think one example of that, and this has resulted from not just the floods that happened in 2017 and the Oroville Dam emergency, but the Tubbs fire and the other fires that followed, it got enough attention that legislation occurred to allow us to have pre-positioning funding for all hazards, and that is a revolutionary step in California response. It gets us ahead of the power curve in those scenarios, and we're looking at pre-positioning not just for wildland weather events, but also mud and debris flow. The next phases we're looking at are going to include potential for a tsunami. What if the state declares another earthquake alert, the 3-day earthquake warning that we did back in the 80s? So, what would the fire service do? Would we think about pre-positioning some resources for something like that? So it's bringing up a whole range of new questions that are going to require some answers and going to require some study by some experienced people to come up with the best solutions. But I can, second what you're saying, and we're trying to lean as forward as we can on all these issues and truly looking at the whole all risk, all hazards approach.
And I think one final thing from me. I have to give a lot of credit to Cal OES, Director Ghilarducci, his vision, his staff's vision, because the things we're talking about doing now 10 years ago was like, no, we'll never be doing that, pre-positioning, earthquakes, none of that stuff was going to happen. And for the public, for the people out there, the majority don't realize that virtually every day of a calendar year, there's somebody deployed outside of their home fire department serving somewhere else in California, if not across the country and the world. And when you say OES is the leader in mutual aid, that isn't by a little bit. That is by head, shoulders, leaps, and bounds. We're doing in California what no other country in the world is doing in mutual aid. And I think that's something everybody needs to remember is how far, even though there are these disparities and there are challenges in thinking outside the box, this state's mutual aid system, the OES system we're running, is the gold standard in the world, and there's just no question about that. So thank you, and thank you, staff, Brian, and everybody out there at OES.
Yeah, we're blessed. Like I said, 7 of the urban search and rescue teams just came back from Hurricane Dorian, and we still had plenty of resources here in the state to back them up, even while that's happening. And Director Ghilarducci has been very adamant about making sure we have redundancy and we don't get drawn down to the point where we're not able to serve the state. So it's a huge challenge in this state with all the hazards we have and all the things we're asked to help others with. But I would agree with you. It's working well, but we know we can always improve it, and that's where the lean forward is happening every day.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Chief.
You're welcome.
Okay, we are still in the the public comment period if there is anybody who would like to address us who has not. And failing that, do we by chance have Michael Winters, the city engineer from Ridgecrest, in the room as yet? Not yet. Okay. Well, he's due at 2:40, so if he's here and available, we will listen. Otherwise, we will take a break until he's due back at 2:40. Oh, excellent. Ma'am, thank you for joining us. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you. Thank you for coming here. We are so proud of all of you here. And we can't wait to learn even more from all of the participants.
So you have sent some really good staff people, and the chief has been outstanding. Yeah. We're
He paid me $1 to say that.
we're hiring in Riverside, Chief. Okay, why don't we just go ahead and take a break until 2:40 then, and that'll get us back on schedule, because we do have some people who are time specific on their ability to be here, and may as well take one big break instead of a bunch of little ones. So thank you all, and see you at 2:40.